What we're talking about is a new report from UNESCO. So this is a way of communicating that report in a way, hopefully, that you find there is that report available to read. Very readable, actually, if you want to go away and read more. The new report is called Who Bears the Costs? And it explores the question, can climate policies increase inequalities? And the answer is clearly yes. The report considers the disproportionate impacts of climate change and the need for designing policies to face climate change, but also in a way that prioritizes inclusivity and fairness. And it shows how the impact of nations' green transitions to low carbon economies and sustainable practices varies. Put my teeth back in. Varies widely depending on where people work, their gender, their income level, and the place they live in. And it highlights the risk of widening socioeconomic inequalities that face our societies. So it's a fascinating report, and it's also a very urgent report, because as you read it, you realize how we are in danger of making these inequalities even greater, and certainly continuing them when we have an opportunity to do something to address them. And I think this conversation, couldn't be better located in some senses, in the sense of what's happening in Cymru and Wales, in that we are just miles away from Port Talbot Steelworks here, which last year, I think, they made 2,500 people redundant. Only this week they are, which was devastating to the people in that community, which is already a community that is not a wealthy one. And the new electric arc furnace that they're building to replace some of the steel making is only starting the building this week. So for me, that is thousands of people, communities and families devastated. Very poor example, a very good example of poor long-term planning, and certainly not a just transition. And this is happening all over the world, isn't it? All over the world. So it's a real pleasure to meet you again, and thank you, Gustavo, for coming along. So first question to you about the report is, as I say, the report makes it painfully clear that both climate change and climate action can deepen existing inequalities, as I've just said. In your view, what mechanisms or policies are most urgent or most urgently needed to ensure that today's climate solutions don't come at the expense of some segments of the population, as we're seeing in Port Talbot? Gustavo.
Thank you, Derek. But before answering, I just want to say for me, it's a real pleasure being here in Wales. I lived here for 2 years as a student in high school in the United World College of the Atlantic here in Vale of Glamorgan, not far from here. I never thought my professional life would bring me back here, so I'm very excited, and very excited to be in the Dylan Thomas Center in particular. So thank you.
Oh, welcome back.
Yes, so coming back to your question, and I think your example is actually quite to the point. In a situation where people were engaged in some activity, some they were in mining or in some heavy industry, and here in Wales we have a lot of that, are becoming redundant as part of the green transition. Now, this doesn't mean that we should not have the green transition. We should have the green transition. But the point is that climate change already has a lot of negative effects on people, and these costs are borne unequally. And that's part of what this report looks at, the unequal burden of climate change. But there's also an unequal burden of climate action, needed climate action. So, you want to do green transition, that means you stop working on certain industries. For instance, you were giving an example here in Wales. I'll give you one in South Africa, where there's this area where 70% of the electricity is generated from coal. So that means that a lot of people are living in the coal industry to provide electricity. So yes, you want renewable energy to replace coal electricity from coal, but you also have a lot of people, many women, many old people, who are going to be out of a job. No? So we need to understand also not just what we need to do for climate change and how to reduce emissions, but we have to understand the social costs as well. Because if we don't, a lot of people are going to suffer, And that's what the report tries to understand. Where are they? Who are they? How's the distributional cost of climate change and climate action born? But also, what do we need to do? And the point here is that climate action by itself is not enough. Yes, we must increase the price of fuel, maybe through taxes, so that there is a reduction in the demand for fossil fuels, for petrol, but as some people are going to be particularly affected, how can we protect them? Because, by the way, these are the people who are then maybe going to, not only are they going to suffer in their livelihoods, but they are also going to be against the climate action. And you see cases, I live in Paris because UNESCO is in Paris, you have the Gilets jaunes in France, neighboring country, a lot of protests by farmers against the rising cost of fuel. But this happens everywhere in all regions of the world. So if you're not taking care of those affected by climate change and by climate change action, you're going to get also opposition to climate action. So we have to do a green transition that makes sense. We have to decarbonize in an inclusive manner. And that includes, for instance, using the revenues from taxes to support those most affected. We have to have social protection for those affected, to protect them against the shocks produced through climate action, just as social protection helps against all the types of shocks. We have to rethink, for example, how we do energy, the problem of energy poverty. Yes, it's very fine, again, turning to renewable energy. That's what we have to do. But if there's no alternative, it might be too costly for some, and then you are energy poor, which is a terrible situation. And we also need to rethink how we use knowledge to inform policy. And that's the value of Bridges Coalition, for instance, to try to find a way of taking a transdisciplinary approach to rethinking the problem, understanding things, not just from the top down, but at the local level, at the indigenous level, understand all the types of knowledge. And so, yes, this report makes that point. It's not just curbing emissions, it's doing it in a way that leads to a fair transition and results in benefits for all, including the success of the climate action itself.
Yeah, and like you say, you see it everywhere, don't you? All over the world. I'm on Monday. I'll be going to the Royal Welsh Show. It's a big agricultural show in Wales. I think it's the biggest agricultural show in Europe. And through a lot of that journey, you will see signs saying no to the new pylons that need to be built for the infrastructure that's needed for green energy and more electricity access across the country. So you see it all over. And I guess one of the frustrations that I have in this role is sometimes these opposition views can be dismissed, can be seen as something that is NIMBYism or, something, people not wanting progress. But actually, it's real, isn't it? And so we have to find ways to hear from people and to understand those concerns and bring people with us on the actions that we need to take. Because if we don't do that, we won't succeed. And one of the things I thought was really interesting in the report was the 3 new indexes that you've included in the report, which I think help help us understand the impact of this more clearly. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about what those indexes are and what that means for climate policies and how we make them, or how they might be different as a result.
Sure. When I was a professor of development, I talked about the curse of the average, and that's because many policies look at the average results, say for an average indicator for a country, for a region, and that hides how the costs are distributed across the population. And the indexes are trying precisely to understand how the costs are distributed across the population. We have 3 indices, as you said. The first one measures the exposure to climate change risk in general. It identifies how different populations are affected. And we find, for instance, that by 2050, and that's another thing, the indices go all the way to 2050, so you can take a long-term view, which is something you might like, looking at future generations. By 2050, around 1/3 of today's world's population, like 2.5 billion people, are going to be living in areas subject to extreme heat for over 3 months, which has a big effect on health, but also on food security, for instance. The other index and that's one I particularly like, is the social vulnerability indexes. And it tries to combine the climate risk from climate change with other structural aspects in a given for a given population that affect their capacity to respond to the challenge of the climate risk. For instance, you might be in a situation where you're facing increased risk from climate because of severe meteorological events. But if the health system where you live is not working well, you don't have access to health, or there's no communication, or so on, you're not going to be able to respond well. You're not going to be able to protect yourself. So what this index tries to link is the risk from climate change with the other structural inequalities, and you see that very often you have a compounding of the effect. And the third index is an index on worker vulnerability, what we're talking about, of those that are affected. The many people, for example, in mining, in coal mining, in heavy industries, are going to be affected. Those in the fuel industry are going to be losing their jobs. As I mentioned, many are women, many are older people. You have to find ways to retrain them, to reskill them. And the idea of these indexes is that they bring a way to understand the problem better and target policies in a much more effective way. As I said, combining the climate action with the social policy. And as mentioned, they look up to 2050, so you have a way to start planning ahead. That's, I think, the contribution of this study.
Perhaps a bit of a supplementary question. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about who is most affected. Which areas of the world, which groups of people are most affected according to the data?
There's different, I said, to avoid the curse of the mean, of the average, there's obviously different kinds of population. For example, in terms of regions, you find, for example, in terms of vulnerability to climate change, Sub-Saharan Africa is particularly vulnerable. Several small islands, developing states are particularly vulnerable. Women in general are more vulnerable. So you find that for different things. And then, for example, for occupations, there's the issue of those in this type of occupation. So I mean, I don't have all the details with me, but that reason to go and get the report. But it tries to look at different regions of the world, at the whole world, and where the risks are according to each index.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting and very clear. It's easy to grasp and understand what the report is telling us. I know also that the MOST program is working on a policy report that looks at social protection systems. So it goes to speaks to one of those indexes that you talked about, and how they're important to easing the transition. But these measures often focus on short-term impacts. So how do we design them in a way that also considers the well-being and opportunities of people 30, 50 years down the line?
Okay. But this study, which is not finished yet, we're trying to make the case that sometimes social expenditures to improve livelihoods, are seen as expenditures, not as an investment. And we're trying to make the case that no, they are an investment, not just for the welfare of the people concerned, but they also make economic sense if you're concerned about, for example, economic growth or other economic performance indicators. And why is that? For example, for social protection. Social protection is there to protect people against risks throughout their lives, unemployment, disability, having children, not having to lose your job to take care of the children, and several other risks. Okay, so obviously they are good, and of course, ill health, bad health outcomes. So all of this, investing in that obviously helps the person. They're going to be in better shape. They're going to not have to leave their job. They can get insurance when they're unemployed. But all of that also has good economic effects. For instance, it produces, if families don't have to put away money in case of a bad outcome that the insurance should protect them from, then they're more willing to spend it and invest it both on things that improve their welfare, like better nutrition or better schooling for the kids. And here's the point of future generations. You can spend more on the welfare of your children, and you can also spend it on physical capital, or capital for your own work activity, which in turn contributes to growth and, of course, better incomes for people. So if you invest in that, you're also creating a situation to improve lives in the future. Now, a key point is that it's not just that any social investment is important. You have to design them very well. You have to see how they link together. It's not just spending money on social. You have to do it to get the desired outcomes. You have to do it well. I want to talk, for example, a program that I'm from Mexico. We had a very good program. Unfortunately, no longer exists. It was very well evaluated. That tried to link. The point was saying it's an anti-poverty program, but it said I'm not going to focus on the poverty of the adults. Now I'm going to focus on things that won't make the children of these adults be poor in the future. In the way, while doing that, I'm of course also improving the livelihood of the adults. So I'm going to make a combination of programs that support better health, better nutrition, and education. So with a conditional cash transfer program, condition first, to get the money, all the family had to go to the health clinic for preventive checkups. To get a scholarship, all the the children had to go to school. Seems obvious, but no, it's important to make sure that they're going to school. And it did other innovations, like there were concerns that if you give money to people, they might spend it on things we don't like. They might spend it on booze, alcohol, they might spend it on cigarettes. But guess what? The evidence shows that it doesn't, they don't. But most important, we found that if you give it to the woman, which was a big change, you would give it to the guy. If you give it to a woman, they're going to spend it more wisely in the family. That's a fact, I think.
That's understood. Yeah.
So, for example, girls families would send their sons to school, but not the daughters often. That's a cultural aspect. And if you try to change the culture, which is very deep, you might take a long time. So there was an economic solution to that. Make the scholarships for girls much more valuable than for boys. So they will still send the boy to school. Well, now it's too expensive to keep your daughter at home because the opportunity cost is very high. So guess what? Originally was for every 10 kids in school, 6 were boys, 4 were girls. Later on, it was 5 and 5. So that works. So my point is, it's not an advertisement of this program. It's the point that you have to link things together to make sure that they have these effects of the long term, and especially you're investing in ways that also help the young and the future generations.
Yeah. Which is what we seek to do in Wales. We're going to have
I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, well, please, yeah.
Well, as you might know, and maybe I'm interrupting, and you can talk about it, Wales has been a real pioneer in ensuring that the welfare of future generations is taken into account in policy. So they made it into law, the policy, and here we have the Commissioner for Future Generation, and I think it's a fantastic exercise, and you can tell us about it. But I also have one specific question. One of the reasons that policymakers often don't look at future generations is because future generations don't vote yet. It's very simple. If you're in a democracy, or children, even if they're alive today, they don't vote yet. And the interest of adults might be different to those of children. But even if you say, well, that's a problem for democracy, well, no, actually, it turns out that autocratic regimes in general also looking at the present, they're not really focusing on future generations either. So how do you, Mike, other than giving you some thought on the general how the program works, how would you break this idea of this incentive to focus just on the short term to be able to look into the long term and future generations?
Okay, well, I'll give you my perspective, and I won't go on too long because Jane's going to speak in a minute and give a keynote speech about our legislation. But I mean, this is something I get asked all the time. How can you expect politicians to focus on the long term when they've got an election next year, or the budget they've got is for 2 years? And I'd say a number of things to that. Well, first of all, we have no choice. We are running out of time to deal with these long-term issues. So we have to find ways within the current context to be able to act on these things. I know that's so easily said, but it's true. I think the other thing that another thing that I say often is it's also bringing it home to politicians and policymakers that this is mattering to people today. So we are doing things today that make a change for people today, but also will do the right thing for future generations. So this is, sometimes there are going to be trade-offs, aren't there? Which, we're doing the right thing. It's going to be maybe against our interests, but in the interest of future generations. But in my experience, usually it's about a cultural mindset of finding the win-wins that make a difference for people today and make a difference for the long term. And there's a common sense to that, which politicians get, the public gets. They understand they need to avoid sticking plaster solutions. We don't need to do things twice because we did something badly the first time. We want to get it right for the first time. But also, the point is politicians, they care about what their constituents think, clearly. So this has to be related to things that matter to people today as well, and showing, this is about clean rivers. This is about having a healthy food system for our kids in school today, as well as my grandkids in 25 years or so. It's about, restoring nature so that we can see nature in a way that I wasn't able to, some of the nature that I enjoyed, when I was young, you can't see now, and bringing that back. So I think it's bringing it back to, to the here and now, doing the right thing, now and for the long term, and making it relatable. And I do find wherever I go in this job that people give this a lot of support. They understand why this is the right thing to do. It's not, people aren't selfish. They want the right things for their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. And one of the wonderful things that we did in Wales, and I wasn't directly involved, so I'm not taking the credit for, was something called the Wales We Want National Conversation. So that engaged people in the future they wanted for our country, and having a sense of where we were going and where we wanted to get to. So, we need to keep at that, and we seek to try and keep at that. But that has meant, broader buy-in and ownership for this approach in Wales than you might have for other pieces of legislation. So that keeps the politicians on their toes as well, because this isn't their legislation. I mean, they brought it in. This is people's legislation. They were involved in shaping it. And the best way we're going to make more change happen is by enabling and empowering people in communities to be advocating for it in their local community, in their council, in their, in their region. So it doesn't come through my office or the minister's office. It's happening as a way of operating in Wales, which we all own and all act upon. And so we've got some way to go, clearly, to get to that way of being. But that's the thinking and that's the approach. We have to end it here, because we need to stay on time, and these people have had a lot of speakers this morning and this afternoon. But I really enjoyed talking to you, Gustavo. Thank you very much for coming to the event, and thank you for the report as well.
Thank you, Derek. By the way, if you go to your browsers, Google, whatever, put UNESCO Who Bears the Cost, you can download it.
Diolch yn fawr. Thank you.